life's hard enough without imposing artificial hardship on people.
They can't predict that. They don't understand that. And they don't know what effect that has.
A lot of them are happy to talk to you when they know that you're not there to just bust them for drugs.
Hello and welcome to the Aussie Wire. This last week has been one of the most enjoyable in a very long time. Why? Because at last we're beginning to see the effect of the pushback that began last year. I'm not saying that we're winning yet, far from it. We still have an enormous amount of work ahead of us, and you can best believe there's some twists and turns in this tale, and we will have to deal with those as we go. But there's been three things in the last week that demonstrate to me that the times, they are a-changin'. And for once, it's in a good way. As you know, because we covered it last week here on the Aussie Wire, the World Economic Forum has been holding its Davos conference. One of the invited speakers was none other than Javier Milei, the newly minted president of Argentina, and a real-life raving libertarian, which is why I like him so much, I confess. Now, of course, he attracts lots of the black pill brigade from the freedom movement who insist that he's controlled opposition and that he only won because they let him and all that nonsense. So when it was announced that he was speaking at Davos, my inbox was full of people saying, "See, what did I tell you?" I told them to wait and see. And boy, was it worth waiting for. I'm tempted to play his entire speech just for this episode, as a dedicated episode, because it's just that good. But I won't. Instead, let me play part of his opening, and we'll give you the link in the description so that you can watch the rest for yourself.
The main leaders of the Western world have abandoned the model of freedom for different versions of what we call collectivism. We're here to tell you that collectivist experiments are never the solution to the problems that afflict the citizens of the world. Rather, they are the root cause. Do believe me, no one better placed than us, Argentines, to testify to these 2 points. When we adopted the model of freedom back in 1860, in 35 years we became a leading world power. And when we embraced collectivism over the course of the last 100 years, we saw how our citizens started to become systematically impoverished, and we dropped to spot number 140 globally. But before having the discussion, it would first be important for us to take a look at the data that demonstrate why free enterprise capitalism is not just the only possible system to end world poverty, but also that it's the only morally desirable system to achieve this.
He goes to absolute town. He schools them, and they had to sit and listen. Now, Milei is an economist. He's one of the world's preeminent Austrian economists. No, he's not from Austria. The Austrian school is a kind of economics, a pro-freedom, pro-capitalism kind. Now, capitalism, not to be confused with corporatism or cronyism. That's an entirely different thing. Sadly, there's not one country on earth that has truly embraced Austrian economics until Milei was elected president of Argentina and is now doing his best to do exactly that. Why? Well, because politicians are much more attracted to the Chicago School of Economics, which is embodied by Keynesianism, Keynesian economics. That is the failed and failing economic model that is being used around most of the world and has brought us to the point of ever-growing government tyranny and simultaneous failing government welfare. Austrian economists are not usually welcome at a place like Davos, but because of Milei's credentials, and now especially with him as a sitting president, they can't really refuse him, and he knows that. And so he took the opportunity and gave them both barrels. It was great to see. But it doesn't stop there. We then saw the Heritage Foundation president, Dr. Kevin Roberts, give WEF an absolute slap, putting them on notice that becoming a conservative president in the US now requires candidates to absolutely reject everything the WEF stands for. Watch.
The kind of person who will come into the next conservative administration is going to be governed by one principle, and that is destroying the grasp that political elites and unelected technocrats have over the average person. And if I may, I will be candid and say that the agenda that every single member of the administration needs to have is to compile a list of everything that's ever been proposed at the World Economic Forum and object all of them wholesale.
Now, this is really interesting to me because it ties in to Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, where Alinsky breaks down the steps for radicals, as they called themselves in the 60s, to bring about social change. I won't rehash his book, but 3 of the key principles were to personalize a problem, i.e. to tie it down to a specific person or group of people or organization. And then, once you've personalized it, to freeze them, i.e. to pin them down in their respective policy positions such that they can't change or maneuver. They have to defend where they are. And finally, once you've done that, you've personalized it and you've pinned them down and frozen them in place, finally you attack relentlessly. It is a brutal and ruthless formula and it works. And what the Heritage president is doing here is putting the WEF on notice that the conservative movement in the US has essentially now made the WEF the persona of the problem. They've personalised the problem onto the WEF, and they're pinning the WEF down on its policy positions and recommendations, and now the attacks are about to begin. And that these politicians will do it as part and parcel of trying to get elected. Being anti-WEF is now one of the most basic criteria to being a viable conservative candidate in the US. That's what the Heritage Foundation president is saying. And he's right. And it represents a huge step forward. And finally, a third great thing this week was US presidential candidate Donald Trump outright rejecting CBDCs. Watch.
Protect Americans from government tyranny. As your president, I will never allow the creation of a central bank digital currency. You know about that? I didn't know you know so much. I'm very, well, New Hampshire, very smart people. Very current. You know what they're doing. Such a currency would give a federal government, our federal government, the absolute control over your money. They could take your money, you wouldn't even know it was gone. This would be a dangerous threat to freedom, and I will stop it from coming.
Now, Trump is not the first Republican candidate to reject CBDCs, but he is the most significant. Because he's not doing it as a point of difference. He's doing it to fit in and to remove the point of difference from the others. And whilst that may sound like splitting hairs, there's actually a world of difference in terms of what it represents. Donald Trump did not need to adopt this position in order to win the Republican nomination. He's set to romp it in regardless. Some of his opponents adopted an anti-CBDC position as a point of difference, and because they believed in it as well. I'm not saying they were being cynical. They believe in it. But they adopted it publicly as a point of difference to try and stand out away from Trump and maybe get some ground back. But Trump has such a huge lead, he didn't need to address this issue at all. He didn't need to take a position on CBDCs. So why did he? Because he recognises that at least within the likely Republican primary voters, it's not going to hurt him. In other words, being anti-CBDC is so mainstream that it's a position you can adopt as a matter of course, in order to fit in with everyone else. And doing so definitely won't hurt you. So let's put this together. In the last week, we've seen Austrian economics on the stage at the World Economic Forum. We've seen WEF being told point blank that a serious campaign to demonise the WEF is now underway, turning the methods of the radicals against them. And we've seen that rejecting CBDCs, which is, by the way, a WEF pet project, is now mainstream. Like I said at the start, we're not winning yet, but this is significant. The pushback began last year, and already early in this year, we're beginning to see what that looks like in practice. Take heart and buy some popcorn. It is going to be a crazy year. But unlike the last few years, it won't all be bad. Now, here's the news. Have you noticed it's been a little bit wet lately? Well, depending on where you live, of course, but if you're in Queensland, and especially on the coast of Queensland, well, look out your window. It's probably raining right now. This has been an extraordinarily wet summer, especially across the eastern side of Australia, and that is contrary to predictions. I'd like to have a chat with Joanne Nova about that because, well, Joe, you've done a wonderful job of covering this on your blog. We've syndicated that blog onto our blog as well. People can check it out there and find yours in the link underneath this video. What is going on? How have we ended up with this discussion of a wet El Nino, a contradiction in terms as far as anything I was told when I was a kid?
Well, Topher, to me, this just, what underlies this is the BOM selling themselves as if they can predict the weather in the long run. And while they're doing a great job up to a point on the short-term forecasts, where we're talking short-term, we're talking 10 days or less, a week, and the weather is really hard to predict. But they sell themselves as being able to tell us what summer is going to be like when clearly they can't. And they have also advertised and made the most with their headlines on the idea that an El Nino summer means dreadful heat and bushfires and all that kind of stuff. And of course, as you mentioned just a minute ago as we were talking, this comes back to the farmers and the farmers needing these 1 to 2 month predictions or next season predictions.
That's right.
So that they can make decisions which cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars if it goes wrong, which it so clearly has, as we can look at what the BOM was predicting in September.
Yeah.
And the headlines from that. And it was clear, the summer was going to be severe heat and it was an El Nino, scary. And there was no mention there that sometimes El Ninos don't end up being dry and hot. And that there was also no mention that the BOM hadn't predicted what was going to happen with this. In fact, none of them did. Their scientists are currently coming out saying, well, it's a bit of a mystery what's going on in 2023. We don't really understand this.
Well, I can remember as a kid, you would assume that tomorrow's forecast was going to be pretty good, and maybe the 3-day forecast, would be average, and then beyond that it was going to be useless. These days, I'll give them credit. I do feel like the 3-day forecast is pretty rock solid, and even out to 7 days can still be a useful indication of what the weather is likely to do. But that's about the limit. And as you said before, predicting the weather is phenomenally complicated. We're talking about a phenomenally complex fluid dynamic system that has a literally impossible to know number of variables that interact in ways that cannot be reliably predicted. But predict is what they try and do. And this was their prediction for rainfall. This hot and dry El Nino was going to cause way below average rainfall. And as you point out in your blog, Joe, that's what actually happened. At some point, you have to ask, if you can't get this right, why are you trying to make these predictions at all? Surely at this point, this is just doing more harm than good.
And I would agree with you, because the BOM sells themselves as if these predictions have a level of uncertainty which makes them worth betting trillions of dollars on. I mean, think about the long-term predictions here. The BOM, the long-term predictions are saying we should bet our entire economy trillions of dollars on changing our weather, on shoring up coastlines, on changing the way we use our land, on building billions and billions of dollars worth of interconnectors in order to put solar and wind in. And all of this bet is based on the BOM saying absolutely for sure the weather 50 years from now is going to be appalling and this and that will happen and so on and so forth. And so, bet the entire economy on the BOM's predictions, and yet they're not honest about the chaos and the chaotic element and the fact that they really can't predict the weather even one summer in advance. And this is what gets me. It's this green ideology, this obsession with CO2, which, all their models are based on CO2. Now, obviously, that's not affecting their 1 week predictions so much, but it is predicting their long-term predictions, their summer predictions are affected by this. The ideology stops them using other factors like solar factors. There's zero influence there from solar wind, zero from solar magnetic effects, from the way the UV and infrared change, from cosmic rays, and the entirety of space weather amounts to nothing as far as the BOM's concerned. So it's no wonder they can't predict the weather in advance.
The phrase space weather would probably sound odd to a lot of people that, unlike you and I, who are tragics, haven't been spending their lives diving into these sorts of things. But space weather is actually a thing, and as well as the movement of the planets, changes in the orbit, Milankovitch cycles, planetary alignments, all of these things, it's not woo-woo horoscope stuff. All of these things do actually have a real-world impact.
And very well, this is it. And we've known since the 1800s, they were aware then that the wheat prices varied according to sunspot cycles. And you think, so nearly 200 years we've realized that there was a connection between sunspots and rainfall, stream flow, groundwater restocking all over the world. So something is going on. Now, we don't know what it is, but nobody's really looking to find out either. And that's my problem with all of this, is that they don't want to find out that the sun actually might control the climate because, well, you can't tax the sun. You can't generate, emissions trading schemes based on what the sun does. So it's just politically they do not want and cannot find a reason for the sun to be driving these things. And because of that, their models just keep failing. But here they are setting themselves up as if farmers and the country and our electricity system should all be redesigned based on bomb expertise, world best standards. And it might be world's best standards, but world's best standards are terrible. Can't we be honest about that? And so this is where people say, well, I think there was one spot up near Cairns that got something like 7 feet of rain in 5 days. Sorry to use the old terms.
The old
like
money.
2 meters. 2 meters, just shocking amount of rain in 5 days, which wasn't predicted in advance by the bomb. So then we are talking 1 or 2 or 3 day predictions. Now, a lot of people who are skeptical of the bomb say, well, we should really be honest and forgive the bomb because no one can predict that kind of stuff. The fact that the cyclone happened to sit there, and I'm talking about Jasper, of course, and sit there so long that it just dumped all of this rain, no one could have seen that coming. And that may well be true. But I am so fed up with giving the bomb guys an excuse, a forgiveness for getting those things wrong while they're busy selling us stuff and selling our nation down the drain in terms of billions of dollars of money taken from farmers and bricklayers and, people who haven't got much money, the poor, paying more for their electricity than they need to in order to do this transition while the bomb sits there silent. The bomb never comes out and says, well, the long-term predictions are full of uncertainty so large, they're far bigger than the trends being predicted. The bomb has no honesty on the long-term predictions. So when they get the short ones wrong and they score a lot of flack for it, which they did this time, then, I'm saying, well, get your act together, guys. Start being honest about the uncertainties and we'll be a lot more forgiving when things go wrong in the short run.
We've been watching some footage there from Channel 9 News showing the absolute devastation that some of these floods have caused. And of course, our hearts go out to everyone that's been affected. This can be very life-changing and in some cases life-destroying and indeed life-threatening when you have these sorts of weather events, particularly if people have not been properly forewarned and had the opportunity to prepare. But you made the comment earlier, Joe, that no one's really looking into this, referring to solar weather and its impact on Earth. And you're almost correct. No one official, no one government is looking into this. But there are actually a few individuals who do factor these things into their discussions. And I know you and I are both aware of Inigo Jones. I'd recommend anyone have a look at his page. I'm aware of AV Weather. I don't know the person's name, but AV Weather is another Facebook page. And also a website called Electroverse, which I've been following now for, it's got to be 10 years or more. And these are the people that over time have really educated me and helped me, along with yourself, of course, Joe. You've been covering many different aspects of this for a decade or more. One of the things that I find particularly striking, I read deeply a lot of Electroverse's content on solar sunspot activity and the impact of that on the climate. And I then derived from his work and my understanding of his work, I then had a look at the history of sunspots and I had a look at the history of the climate in the southeast of Australia. And in 2020, if you go back to my very first ever Slow Chat, I talked about the fact that the following number of years, and I believe it'll be decades, but certainly years, were going to be wetter and cooler than average. Now, that was early in 2020 that I went public with that particular prediction. And I'm sorry, but 2020, 2021, 2023, and now the start of 2024 have most certainly followed that prediction. Now, I'm not a genius and I'm not even a subject matter expert. I'm just paying attention to the people that actually know what they're talking about. At some point, you have to wonder if other people have figured this out. Is it more than just incompetence or what have you? Is there an agenda playing out here with the way that the bomb are getting this so wrong?
Well, and obviously, and it might be honest guys sitting in an office, but no one at the tea room will admit that the sun is more than just a big ball of light. They treat the sun. They look at the TSI, which is total solar insolence that coming off. They've got that sorted, and it does barely vary. So they look at that and say, well, the amount of sunlight falling on us is pretty much the same from year to year. It doesn't have an effect, but they ignore the fact that it's an electrodynamic ball with an enormous magnetic field that stretches out far beyond Pluto and changes. And the solar wind comes at us at 1 million miles an hour. That's streams of charged particles. And I'm not exaggerating or just throwing that. It is actually 1 million miles an hour. And it changes direction, sometimes coming up from the south, from the north. And I'm talking on a minute by minute basis. It shifts and flicks. The speed increases, it doubles, it shrinks. They can't predict that. They don't understand that. And they don't know what effect that has on the climate either, except then we have all these puzzling links going back years that, in the 1800s, people knew that the price of wheat varied according to the sunspot cycle. And we look at studies like groundwater recharge rates in China, far below the amount of groundwater building up, which obviously is a reflection of the amount of rainfall falling. That it also ties with, solar cycles and jet streams. So something is going on and we don't know what it is. And I might also mention Piers Corbyn at this moment, the brother of the famous Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. And Piers has been predicting the weather for years. And I don't know if you heard the story about him about 20 years ago when he was making bets against the official Met Centre in the UK.
Was he?
And the betting agencies and the brokers actually banned him because he was better than the UK Met. And they banned him from making bets because he was cleaning up.
That is amazing. That's the first time I've ever heard of that. Look, Joe, that's all we've got time for, but this is such a striking story now. The inability and or unwillingness of the BOM to accurately predict medium-term weather trends, and as you've so rightly pointed out, to just be honest about the uncertainties and to let us in on the fact that they really can't know a lot of these things is very, very striking and calls into question why we're spending so much. You look like you had a last comment there.
I do. One more point, which is that the BOM now has the standard absolving itself of liability added onto their website. Apparently, when you click with their app, it now forces people to agree that the BOM has a 699-word terms and conditions statement, which includes that the information at this app may not be accurate, complete, or current. And, what do we pay them for? To get things right, or at least to be honest about what they don't know. But there we are. We pay for it, and then we tick a box that says, well, the BOM can be as wrong as they want, and who cares?
Well, I think if that's going to be their position, then we should say that their paycheck may not be complete or current. That seems like a fair trade to me. Look, Joanne Nova, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, the construction of renewable energy projects continues apace in this country. There are every year renewed claims that we're getting closer and closer to net zero, even though whilst the percentage of so-called renewable energy may increase, the absolute amount of coal that's being used worldwide and oil and other fossil fuels is increasing at the same time. It seems like we're chasing our tails here. But if you drive through the countryside, you're going to see an awful lot of wind turbines and an awful lot of very large industrial scale solar farms. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing if you understand how the grid works. And there are plenty of people who do, and there are some people who have had enough and saying, hey, it's time to get to Canberra and let Canberra know what we think about these so-called reckless renewables. And Grant Piper from the National Rational Energy Network joins me now. Grant, you guys are organising a reckless renewables rally in Canberra soon. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we've combined forces with the coastal groups, Illawarra and the Port Stephens Central Coast, and also the groups down in South Australia and Victoria, as well as the inland groups subject to this stuff. And we're getting together for a rally to try and protest the whole process and the whole ideology behind the renewables push. We'll use renewables. I hate the term because they're not when you look at it from a technical point of view. And we just want to make it known that we're not going to be, life's hard enough without imposing artificial hardship on people. And this is what this is. I mean, there's nowhere in the world that's powered by 82% renewables. No first world economy has done it. Probably no one's done it since, the 1700s probably, or back in the dark ages, which is where we're heading if you do this. And we know this. There's plenty of technical people, there's plenty of economics background people, historians who point this out. But we seem to have this government and the bureaucracy that is just pushing it through legislation and in every doorstop interview they do, and then the media reinforces it on every TV show, on every radio show. Everything you hear is to say it's transition's got to happen, we're doing it, yada, yada, yada. But they don't realise the cost. They don't realise the cost on business, on individuals, and the environment. And it's just all arse about it. It shouldn't happen.
Talk us through that a little bit, Grant, because you've got this rally coming up here. You're saying that people are going to be coming from all over the place to support this rally. But for those that perhaps aren't seeing it with their own eyes, what are the things that these people are experiencing that would cause them to want to come to a rally like this?
Well, personally for up here, like we've got land to be acquired for power lines, which wouldn't happen otherwise if they weren't trying to build a wind farm, north of us. We're in a central West Arana renewable energy zone, which are areas that they've dictated or mapped out to say, this area is right for development, and we want all the proponents to come forward and build their stuff in these renewable energy zones. Now, that makes you a second-class citizen straight away. What does that do to your land and your business future and your prospects? Now, this zone started with 3.5 gigawatt installed. It's about 200 kilometres by 200 kilometres, so it's about 40,000 square kilometres or something like that. 3.5 gigawatt, and now they've pushed to 4.5 gigawatt, and in the paperwork it's going to 8 or 9 gigawatt with 20 gigawatt of installed capacity.
Wow.
And that includes with batteries as well. So for a solar farm, you need about 25 square kilometres for 850 megawatt. Turbines, we're looking at over 1,000 out here, and I can't remember the footprint per megawatt for the turbines, but it's huge. It's much larger than solar. And all this has to be connected with massive power lines. And this is just the thin edge of the wedge. I mean, what we're experiencing now, and we've been batting Department of Primary Industries planning, and the proponents now for in excess of 2 years, power lines 4 or 5 years. This is just the beginning. It's not going to stop for the next 20 or 30 years. And even Energy Co admit that the whole region will change from fundamentally agricultural to industrial in nature. They admit that. But there's been no vote on it. There's been no discussion on it.
Now, the nature of renewables is, as you've mentioned already, it's advertised to us, it's sold to us on the basis of being good for the environment. But the facts behind this betray that idea. What are some of the environmental impacts that we're both observing and we can expect to see going forward as a result of this proliferation of so-called renewable energy?
Well, there's two ways to look at that. You can look at the local, which is really, well, they don't even look at the local. Like the local devastation to the farmland, obviously covering farmland with solar panels, they're only going to last 15 or 20 years. There's studies showing that they leach, toxic chemicals into the soil, and there's these other problems, and then they've got to dispose of them. Disposal of the turbines, disposal of the panels, that's all landfill type stuff. There's no recycling in place at the moment. They talk about it, in the future we'll do it. And then there's the, knocking down woodland and in environmental areas and koalas and the tops of the hilltops that you've seen up in Queensland, all up and down the Great Dividing Range. That's going to happen. And that doesn't get covered by the media, and that isn't counted as some sort of cost. So that is by an offset somewhere. So there's all that local environmental devastation, which is quite visible to everyone. Like when you drive around and I drive around, we see the solar farms. But there's also the total environmental cost of the mining and the extraction and the manufacturing of the materials that go into the solar panels and the wind turbines. You got to mine more. The minerals and the fossil fuel energy companies are loving this because it all takes fossil fuel to manufacture, transport, and install this stuff. And so it because of their inefficiency of solar and wind, they consume more resources and they produce less power. So the net result is you consume more resources and produce less power, which means you create more pollution, you need more materials and minerals and energy to process, and you produce less power. So if you think back to high school physics, that's the first law of thermodynamics was you can only get out what you put in, and the second law is you can't even get that. So because they're so inefficient, you consume more. So if you're worried about saving the planet or reducing emissions, the fact you're pushing for these renewables means it will consume more and produce less. We'll create more emissions earlier than if we just burnt coal to make power 365 days a year, or nuclear, or gas, or what have you. It's an inefficient way to use those energy dense resources to make turbines and solar panels.
Look, this is one of the great truisms of conservation. The most environmentally friendly thing that you can do is to keep using what you've already got. If somebody is driving a new car and they tell you that they updated their car because it was more efficient, they're lying to themselves. They bought a new car because they wanted a new car, and they're justifying it on the basis of efficiency. If you call yourself an environmentalist, I better see you driving a car that's at least 20 years old. Otherwise, I'm going to start to question your credentials, and that's exactly the same as what's going on here. Now, this is an image by Jeffrey Grimshaw, and I've got another one here from him. He's done a wonderful job of just graphically representing just the costs and the energy density involved, or the energy consumption involved, and the environmental damage involved in creating the so-called renewable energy. Now, he's actually one of the speakers who's going to be at the Reckless Renewable Rally on the 6th of February 2024, Parliament House, Canberra. Tell us who else is going to be there speaking.
Yeah, we've got a long, I won't read through them all. We've got Professor Ridd, we've got Jacinta Price, Senator Ralph Babet, Renee, Dr. David Gillespie, Barnaby Canavan, Stephen Tripp, Rob Parker, Alan Moran.
It's a rock star
Kate Mason
list.
is talking.
It's a rock star. It's a rock star list. It's an incredible list, and it's made me very jealous because unfortunately I'm going to be in America at the time and on work, and I can't be there. But I'm actually a little bit annoyed because I would have loved to have been there, tried to fight my way to the front row, and hear some of those incredible people speaking. Do you have any indication from communities as to what you can expect when it comes to people? I'm guessing really that's anyone's guess at this point in time.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to get a feel for. I'm just hoping momentum is building, interest is building. We're getting more calls from various people now. I mean, we're paying the insurance premium for 5,000 people, and I hope it's 10 times that. That'd be really nice.
Look, I'm right there with you. I tip my hat to you. It's an enormous amount of work and an enormous cost in terms of time, in terms of opportunity and other things you could do. And then also financially, there are costs involved in organising a protest. And I respect enormously the fact that yourself and the rest of the team at Reckless Renewables and the National Rational Energy Network, that is a bit of a tongue twister, by the way. I've got to say, that's a tough name to say fast. But what you guys are doing is fantastic. I wish I could be there, and I hope it's a huge success. And to everyone watching, we'll put the link for you to find out more information into the description of this video. Grant Piper, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Topher. We'll be live streaming as well, but we'll get those details out.
Perfect. Well, the issue of party drugs and pill testing has suddenly hit the headlines again because of some very unfortunate circumstances for some very unfortunate party goers. But this is one of those problems that is always boiling away in the background. And it's one of those things that I used to have a hard-lined anti-drug, lock 'em all up kind of stance. It's one of those areas where I've changed quite a lot. But I wanted to get some thoughts from someone who's actually been face-to-face with the realities of the drug problem, such as it is. How bad is it? I don't know. I'm going to hear from Krystle Mitchell, former acting senior sergeant with the Victoria Police. Krystle, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Topher.
Now, there have been calls in response to a number of hospitalisations, they believe, from MDMA, people taking these at parties or taking these at raves, being hospitalised. There have been calls for pill testing to be allowed. You've been quite vocal on this, and correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to believe that that would be a beneficial step.
I do. I have worked a lot of these raves. The last one was a overnight one, I think, at Marvel Stadium, and it was Tiesto, I think, and lots of young kids are there, and a lot of them are happy to talk to you when they know that you're not there to just bust them for drugs. And that was very much the briefing that we received when we worked that rave, that we weren't there to bust people for drugs. We were there for safety. We were there to help people if they had issues on the floor, which some did, but we weren't there to bust them. And these kids do want pill testing because they don't want to be taking substances that are laced with super harmful chemicals. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like the message about abstinence. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work for children, for young people. And saying no to drugs does not work for young people either. They're young. They want to experiment. And we should be providing them an opportunity to be able to do that safely.
Now, this seems to be an area where there's an opportunity to reach across the political divide. It's not very often that I find myself in furious agreement with the Greens, but credit where it's due. The Greens have been right on this issue since long before I became right on this issue. I was very, very wrong on this issue in my younger years. And they're saying that it's cowardly for the Premier to turn around and say, no, we're just going to continue with the current strategy. How do we reach across the aisle on this? What's the coalition of people and of parties potentially that could get some common sense into this issue?
Well, yes, I agree. It is quite surprising to find yourself in agreement with the Greens for a change, but they are right on this issue. And I think that there are probably many politicians on the Labor side that would be pro this issue as well. They're just too reluctant to say. I'm not sure about the Liberals. It really depends whether or not they're a Liberal progressive or a Liberal conservative. I would say Conservatives say no. In fact, I think former politician Bronwyn Bishop spoke about this issue not long ago, and she, again, just unfortunately gave the message of say no to drugs, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
We do need to bring politicians and all sides of politics together, because what are we talking about? We're talking about the lives of young people in Australia. And if that's not our priority, I don't know what is.
I just finished reading a book titled Defending Conscience, and it discussed in detail the Prohibition era in the US, where there was this moral panic against alcohol. They successfully had it outlawed in their constitution, and it led to all kinds of terrible things. Oftentimes, the cure can be worse than the disease. What we're looking at here is an ABC report from the last couple of days talking about exactly this problem. And I find that interesting. I mean, clearly these events are very popular. People want to be there. They're volunteering to go there. They're spending money to go there. They're choosing to buy these substances and to take them. I've never taken an illegal drug in my life, but it's not really my place, I don't think, to tell them that they can't, as long as they're doing so responsibly. How do we avoid a moral panic type response and a prohibition era type response and all the harms that come from that? What's the approach we should be taking?
We should be taking a moderate and sensibly balanced approach to this issue. It isn't a new issue. Kids have been taking experimental party drugs for years. I mean, you only need to look back to the Underbelly series to know how popular party pills were here in Melbourne. And if we approach this like we're approaching a lot of issues around today, which is just with hype and hysteria and panic, then it is only going to end up worse for kids. If you tell children, and I say kids because I'm old, and I don't mean kids, I mean young people, obviously. But if you tell these young people that there's going to be a strong police presence and sniffer dogs at these raves, all it does is encourage them to take all of the drugs that they have with them at once because they don't want to get caught, and you are going to see an increase in overdoses. We should be educating our children, first and foremost, obviously, that there is a risk in any drug you take. That's why when you listen to a pharmaceutical ad, it has 10 seconds of all of the different adverse effects that can happen from legal drugs. Illegal drugs are no different. They just have side effects that we don't talk about very publicly because the drugs are illegal themselves. Children need to be educated on the illegality of the drugs and the harms that they cause, but they also need to be taught about safe drug taking. And that might be a controversial place to sit, but it's a place that I firmly believe is the right direction for our young people.
What's the impact of these sorts of hardline policies on morale for the police officers themselves? Obviously, they don't really get a say in the policies. They just have to make a choice. Am I going to go along with this and enforce this, or am I not? Am I going to take a stand, as you obviously did when it came to the COVID policies? This is a different issue now. What's the effect? They're already struggling to retain numbers. They're already struggling to recruit. Do you think a change of policy in this area, a less adversarial policy, would have a positive impact on morale and retention? Absolutely. It would have a positive effect if the situation was that you were briefed that you were there as a safety presence and as a support for the other agencies that attend these events to keep partygoers safe. By having these rules in place, all you're doing is creating more paperwork ultimately for the police officer, because realistically, these young people will be issued with drug cautions. They might be forced to go down a path to do a particular program, or they might be sent to court, tying up police and court resources. And so that's the outcome that you get on one side with police. The outcome on the other side is more dead kids. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, it seems like a terrible lose-lose, as the Prohibition always was. We have that as a historical lesson, but as the saying goes, those that do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and those that do learn from history are doomed to stand by helplessly watching everybody else repeat it. And that's the frustration of, I guess, being in your shoes, Krystle Mitchell. Thank you so much for joining us once again on the Aussie Wire.
You're welcome.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes and read our daily blog at theaussiewire.com. Follow all our socials via @theaussiewire and become an insider. That's a financial supporter of the Aussie Wire with the link in the description. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire. Okay, done. Done.